Hi, I'm Jesse Hirsch, and welcome to another episode of MetaViews, recorded live at the Academy of the Impossible, where I'm actually now doing daily walks with the goats, and it is fantastic for my sanity and thinking power. And we got Jeremiah Patterson back, and I kind of titled this News, Attention, and Power, although we are in the tail end of season 2 here at MetaViews, and our conversations are very spontaneous. They're all over the map. We're trying to really allow for a lot of improvisation, a lot of riffing, a lot of emotional analysis of kind of what's happening in the news, in the world, and everything in between. And I personally have a few things I do want to talk to you about today, Jeremiah. I hope you also have come with your own kind of modest agenda, or at least some things in the back of your head that you're hoping to crack out. But as you know, we start every episode of MetaViews with the news, partly because MetaViews publishes a daily newsletter, although... when I say daily, it's kind of like 4 days a week these days, because, spring, the growing season has just been quite a bit in terms of my own physical body and ability to be doing what I do. But our current recent issue is around the machinery of misogyny and really getting into kind of the way in which online culture has been really undermining a lot of men's sense of self and, unfortunately, their violence towards others. And I'm currently working on a post that I may publish this evening. I may save till tomorrow, which is on Netanyahu. And Netanyahu is kind of a terror unto himself, and how on the one hand he does mirror Trump in terms of everything he does is for his own self-enrichment and, most importantly, to stay out of jail, but he has a ruthlessness that makes him a very dangerous person. So I'm currently, I kind of got the research done, and I'm working on what the format of the piece is going to be. But I have, as the purpose of this news segment, an opportunity to throw to our guest, which normally they are not as avid a news producer as yourself. But, we nonetheless want to get our guest perspective on the news, on what they think our audience should know. So it's an open-ended question. I think you and I are going to talk about news throughout today's episode, not just here at the forefront. But I'll give you the same question I give everybody. What are you paying attention to, Jeremiah? What's kind of on your news agenda as we reach you here on this Friday, the last of May?
There is an interesting story unfolding with regards to what Trump is doing at the EPA. And like the guy that he put at the EPA is like Lee Zeldin, and he is basically cozying up to oil lobbyists and everything and all the air pollutants. It's the same. It's the same situation where you're supposed to be regulating these agencies as an environmental protection agency. That's what it's called. And it's like, it's almost worse than what Ann Gorsuch did like in the 1980s when she led EPA. It's just appointing people to positions that are contrary to the mission of that agency to destroy it from inside.
Well, and that's just it. I think for the last 10 years, we've heard this phrase in policy circles called regulatory capture. And it's when industry has so much influence on the regulator that they become ineffective. But this is more. This, to your point, is regulatory destruction, right? Regulatory sabotage, driven by the interests of industry, but with very long-lasting effects. And relatedly, I saw a fascinating interview on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman that looked at, that compared our current moment with the McCarthy era, where the McCarthy era was on one end an attack against civil servants, an attack against left-leaning academics and cultural leaders. But this is greater because this isn't so much an attack on individuals, it's an attack on institutions.
Mhm.
It's an attack on regulatory agencies as a whole, not so much the individuals who work within it. And that suggests that the impact of this particular sabotage campaign, for lack of a better phrase, will be felt for some time. I'm curious, if as part of your work and your reporting, you've done any interviews or done any research around the long term impacts of the kind of the fire. I want to say fire sale, but the 5 alarm fire that is
Yes,
happening to
yes.
the regulatory bodies in the United States.
And to your point about McCarthy, that definitely is a parallel that can be drawn. But I think what people sort of misconstrue about that moment is that, as you said, it was attacks on individuals. I mean, what we're seeing now is like attacks on institutions and gutting it completely because the administrative state is out to get conservatives. And it's just this crazy, asinine, nonsensical theory that, they've drawn up and they're enacting Project 2025 throughout the government. But I have interviewed, experts and journalists, and one of the things that I asked them about in regard to the destruction that's happening with these agencies is what's the long-term impact? And like it's honestly the most horrifying question once you get to the end of the interview, because some of them will say, well, some of this damage is irreversible, or it's going to take, decades or centuries to clean up. And it's like, just ah.
I think the exhale, the sigh is fundamentally the answer. While on the one hand there are a lot of misleading ideas and philosophies driving, the policies, I think the one policy that they do share, the one ideology they do share, that I can't refute, is the idea that if they destroy the administrative state, if they discredit the regulatory agencies, then it allows for might is right.
Mhm.
Then it allows for industry and corporations to do what they wish. And on some level, they're not wrong about that analysis. But I actually, where I do disagree is I don't think industry will be successful. And I
Mm.
say this because regulation leads to trust, and you need trust to actually deal with other businesses, to deal with partners, to deal with people in general. So that's where I do share the broad exhale, the broad holy fuck, what the hell is going on? But I still have a little bit of hope that they are shooting themselves in the foot. And,
Yeah.
and, and that in the end, there will be opportunities for us to rebuild, to reconfigure, to reconceive the role of the state. And that nicely segues us to our WTF segment, or What's the Future, where we are a future-centric show. And here, Jeremiah, I'll give you where I normally just throw to the guest and say, hey, what's on your event horizon? I will give you a more two-part question on that, because on the one hand, as a journalist, your event horizon is very much part of your work in
Mhm.
terms of, trying to figure out what stories to follow, trying to connect the dots between, different events. But I'm also curious on what you see as your future, and the future of the Jeremiah Patterson show, and your thinking as not just a journalist but as a news producer, right? And someone who is really thinking about how you do your work. And I say this because since you and I first started talking, your productivity has shot through the roof. But I think so has your momentum, right?
Uh-huh.
In that I think you got a lot of wind in your sails, and it's giving you a sense of your own future. So, feel free to take the question in either or both directions in terms of what's on your event horizon, both individually as a professional, but also for us as a society in terms of what you're paying attention to
Mm.
in your own professional endeavors.
That is definitely a great question, and I would definitely say the same thing. The productivity has shot up significantly since we last spoke. Um, I guess covering the first Trump administration when I was like 13 to like 17, that was like an interesting time. But it wasn't as like fast paced as this. Like there's like 1,200 news stories every single day. So it's like making a list of like the 1,200 news stories and deciding what are some of the most important things that I can cover on the show or bring to the forefront. And that's what I try to do. But also highlighting stuff that's they're also doing that many people aren't talking about, like, trying to destroy the US Institute of Peace for whatever reason. I mean, it's just like these low-level government agencies that function perfectly, that are fine, that, help us in society, that are being targeted. And I just feel like it's a time where I have a duty as a journalist to be even more active and to work even harder to do even more interviews, because the information has to get out there. We're living in an age of misinformation, so there's a lot going on with that. I feel like where we are in terms of a society looking at this as a future is going to have to be continued resistance, to what's happening here. The free press is under attack. NPR, getting defunded. PBS as well, and they're fighting back. So I think it's standing up for the free press in this moment, and the institutions as well, and just making sure that we're continuing to push stories out there that are not necessarily talked about in the mainstream press,
Right
like
on.
local coverage as well. Because
And
you and I
please continue.
you and I have spoken about Huey Long. So I did a segment I think it was last week, about what Republicans are doing in the states. And it's like focusing on what's happening in your state, because that's how it starts right there.
Well, and let me ask you this follow-up question. And I did that kind of segue to indicate we're now into the feature conversation, because I do want to talk about news and
Mhm.
attention and power. Because you touched upon something there, which I think is the operational question that all journalists face. I would argue it's also the ethical question that journalists face. But from a managing your time and resources, it's kind of the same thing, which is, what are the stories you chase?
Yeah.
Are they going to be the stories that are getting the most attention? Are they going to be the stories that you think are the most important and crucial, right? And this is, I think, something that a lot of journalists are not able to take the time to reflect on because they're
Mhm.
just constantly working. But you are in the unique position where, the only people ostensibly that you're answerable to is your audience.
Mhm.
So you have, as an independent journalist, a greater degree of autonomy and power to choose what you cover. But I'm curious what pressures you face, either internal in terms of yourself and your own
Mhm.
kind of ambitions or ethics or moral code, but also the people around you, your readers, right? The people who comment. How do you wake up every day and decide what to chase, what to cover? I'm curious more to provoke you to think about this out loud, so that we can understand. Because I think this is a question a lot of journalists wrestle with
Yeah.
all the time, but don't always get the space to really reflect on it.
Yes, that is definitely a dilemma that I really have every single day, waking up and looking at the news stories, because it's almost like you're tuggling with, what's is the best worst story to cover, in a sense.
Yeah,
It's like,
that's a
do
great
I
phrase.
want do I want to cover, what they're doing to, deport kids with cancer, or do I want to cover what Doge is doing and enacting, Project 2025? Or do I want to cover this massive budget bill that's going to cut Medicare and Medicaid? So it's like constantly tugging with the best worst story to cover, and it's a lot. I mean, sometimes I'll have to siphon through segments, and I have like 4 or 5 different segments, like when I do like my evening shows, and it's like, okay, what's going to be the story that I put at the top, because that's what I'm telling listeners is most important. And sometimes it looks like covering stories that aren't getting enough attention, and that may be less views, that may be less likes, but it really has to be the passion that pushes you forward.
And to that point, what tools do you kind of rely upon? And in the past, we've talked about kind of the sources, right?
Mhm.
The media that you consume to kind of get ideas and get inspiration. But part of the thread that I've been hearing in our conversation today is the potential threat of information overload. And
Yes.
you answered it in terms of what's the best worst story. But what tools, and I mean this both intuitively in terms of like search engines or websites, but also more from a productivity perspective, how are you managing all this stuff? Like, how is your workflow developing?
ChatGPT is a very great tool. They have like this
And it's a search engine now.
Yes, they have this very they have this like tool that's like for deep research. So I could be like, please find me articles on um Trump dismantling, Inspector General, something like that. And so they'll find me like a bunch of articles on that. But what I also do is I go to my sources. I rely very heavily on investigative journalist outlets like ProPublica, The Intercept, also reading stuff like The New Republic that's very upfront. I rely on sites like that, and then if it's like legal or anything to do with the government, I'll go to like Government Executive or Courthouse News. And so it's like, as a journalist, having different sources that you rely on for your news, and making sure that you're constantly checking in on those, because sometimes there will be stories that the mainstream press is covering, but if you go to those different sites, you'll find underreported stories that need pressing attention.
And going back to I like using the phrase stakeholders to kind of describe the audience. The other phrase I often use is constituency, in the sense that when you're an independent journalist, as I was saying earlier, you're kind of answerable to your audience, right? You're
Mhm.
answerable to the people whose support you're trying to earn. I'll disclose from my own personal experience. My mom reads every issue that I put out, and she's
Uh-huh.
usually the first person to comment. So she's like my North Star, right? Like, she
Mhm.
is the person I'm kind of writing for and thinking for. Do you have people like that in your audience? Like, when you're writing, when you're producing content, who in your audience are you thinking of in terms of, if they get upset, if they have an issue with your work, they're the ones you're most kind of accountable to, and you're like, oh damn, I really gotta fix that because I don't want them to be pissed off. I'm curious if you have that kind of same, stakeholder relationship.
Mm. I definitely always have believed that community is important, especially with your audience, because you're building a connection through the camera. I feel as if uh I guess the pressure honestly is highly intense. Like even yesterday, recording, even though I've been doing this for like nearly 7 years, I was super nervous to get on camera and to record, because I mean, it gets to a certain point where it's not just you in front of the camera anymore. You're broadcasting to like hundreds or thousands of people, and you have a responsibility, not to say anything wrong. If you mess up, you have to, you know, go back on it. And it's just it's a huge responsibility. So I definitely do feel that pressure. And I would feel like it's among some of the most loyal members of the audience who are always, liking or commenting. You definitely feel an obligation to get it right, but also to go above and beyond. And I feel like as an independent journalist, that kind of gives you a perfectionist mindset, where sometimes you could even develop an unhealthy work habit.
Well, and we'll come back to that, but as a parallel, speaking as an old guy to a relative young guy, your hardest and most severe critic will be you in the future.
Yes.
That when you look back at this work after you've aged and you go, oh man, if I only knew then what I do now. That's where even now I'm anticipating that the audience for this is me in the future, and I'm
Mhm.
going to be very self-critical. There was a few things I wanted to pick out before we come back to that, work life balance, and it really resistance has been a kind of through line in a lot of your work. So I'm curious to talk again in terms of the long terms, some of the stories that you're keeping an eye on, and some of the stuff we've mentioned today so far is like the attacks against regulatory agencies, even innocuous ones, and with that, I think there's a kind of a slice of corruption that we've seen in Trump's recent Middle East visit,
Mhm.
right? Where it seems that it's the Trump Corporation that's benefiting even
Yeah,
more than the United States of America from his foreign
exactly.
policy work. But where is your kind of radar in terms of, the other? I was gonna sort of jump in when you were talking about the first Trump administration compared to the second Trump administration. That it seems the biggest lesson he's gleaned is speed.
Mhm.
That the faster he goes, the harder it is for the Democrats to respond, the harder it is for the public to keep up. So amidst that kind of high velocity news environment, what are you keeping your eyes on long term? And you alluded to local news, so I'm curious if there's particular areas of the country or particular kind of local contests or local issues. Again, brief the MetaViews crew on, as we watch America, what are some of the key stories? What are some of the key metrics or indices that you're following that we should be following?
Mm. There is a story in Oklahoma where there is a superintendent named Ryan Walters. He's a Republican, and he is trying to basically install this course for high school students in Oklahoma schools that basically you're going to be taught that the 2020 election was stolen. You're going to be taught you're gonna be taught about discrepancies in the 2020 election. Like that's gonna be an actual high school curriculum course. So I think that story in and of itself is insane. And then he's also considering running for governor. He's the same guy that wants to put Trump Bibles into Oklahoma schools. And there has been pushback on that, not just in protests, but also in litigation. And it's going to be interesting to see if that actually succeeds. So once again, that's part of like the ground roots resistance that we're seeing happen. I know in Nashville, Tennessee, there is a local story where there was pushback on the mass deportation campaign there, as they're having like ICE and local law enforcement working together to do traffic stops to arrest migrants there. And there's like this local action group that just started, and they're alerting migrants and individuals to not go to certain places or to not take certain exits. So it's just the ground roots resistance that is building right now across the country, and you'll find a lot of that in your local stories, even if you can't find it in the mainstream press. And so I just feel like it gives me hope looking at it from the outside in.
Well, and to your point, often, connecting on social media with local activists,
Mhm.
they're the kind of primary sources in a lot of these news stories, that in cultivating those relationships, it makes it easier to, see this resistance rising before the mainstream media does, before
Yeah.
the traditional media. And I want to come back to the kind of role of local media and get some of your thoughts on that. But the other dynamic of the speed of the Trump administration is to really has been their attempt to keep the judiciary on the flat foot, to kind of have the courts, the slowness of the courts, be a weapon for the Trump administration in terms of pushing its policies forward.
Mhm.
But it does seem as if we're seeing a bit of a judicial pushback of trying to say, hey, you can't do these things. They ruled this week that a lot of the tariffs that
Mhm.
had passed are not constitutional, and there've been a range of other judicial rulings. What's your take here? I mean, both, do you think that the power of the judiciary will matter, or will Trump defy the judiciary and create a larger crisis because he'll just be like, nah, fuck you to the courts
Mhm.
and continue to do whatever policy he wants? I mean, Stephen Miller seems to be giving that kind of posture. As someone who follows this much closer than I do, to what extent is the judiciary part of the resistance, or more just a bump in the road in terms of the ongoing rise of the Trumpian authoritarianism?
I think, to use an overused terminology, it's gonna get worse before it gets better. And I'm kind of pessimistic on the if it's gonna get better part, because we've seen flat out disregard for, the judiciary branch. I mean, we just had a federal judge write a scathing rebuke of the Trump administration trying to go after law firms. And a federal judge in the ruling is using like exclamation marks. And judges don't use exclamation marks
Yeah.
because they try to maintain decorum. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I mean, with the US Court of International Trade, what just happened there is they said, hey, you can't do this with the tariffs because it's unconstitutional and that power belongs to Congress. You're also just, you can't declare tariffs on every country in the world. And what happened with that is that basically they appealed it. It went to the appeals court, and they have allowed Trump to temporarily do the tariffs. And now he's trying to get the Supreme Court to allow him to just do the tariffs for, for the rest of the presidency. So it's kind of like this back and forth thing. But I do think that their disregard for the judiciary is extremely dangerous.
Hmm.
I mean, every time there's a ruling against the administration, they're calling the judges activist, or they're saying, this judge needs to be impeached. Like, I just feel like there's no longer a, a respect for the judiciary, and I think this is going to be something that gets worse
Hmm.
as we see, the constant attacks continue.
Well, and that's where I agree with you that the details are in local stories. The
Mhm.
details are in local communities, partly because that's where we all live
Mhm.
physically, literally, but that's also where community organizing tends to have the biggest impact. Am I correct in believing that you've moved over the last couple of months or recently? Do you mind me asking where you moved to?
Yes, I've recently moved to South Carolina, back to South Carolina.
Right on. And what is your local news scene like? What is the local news industry like? Is it heavily consolidated in terms of corporate control, or are there kind of decent local news outlets that you're able to tap into, or has it become more social media that it's like blogs and independent journalists like yourself rather than, more healthy or vibrant local media?
It's definitely, we have lots of independent, well, limited independent news here. And sources that are in the mainstream press, like, well, not in the mainstream press, but in local media like the Post and Courier, the Live 5 News, all the, News 2 is another one. But it's understanding, like, for something like the newspaper, which is quite an interesting phenomenon, is the fact that the local press in itself is like eroding. And I
Yeah.
feel like that's kind of the scariest part because, you know, when it comes to direct and representative democracy, you're going to want to know what's going on in your local area, and the local press holds local officials accountable. And so, stories like that are essential, but I feel like it's very painful to watch the erosion of the local press, and I
Hmm.
just feel like that's something that we have to continue to keep alive and to fund and support. Otherwise, we're going to see a lot more corruption and authoritarian antics.
Well, and do you? I mean, you certainly prioritize key kind of catalyzing stories like the one you gave of Oklahoma. But
Mhm.
do you ever focus on really local in terms of your backyard and your neighborhood? Only because you sort of recognize that if you don't do it, it may not be told, it may not be
Yeah.
heard.
Yes, that is definitely something that I looked into focusing on. I remember there was a story recently about a South Carolina woman actually that had a miscarriage, and then she got arrested because of the anti-abortion laws here. So it's like covering stories like that are extreme, that's happening in your state, that you need to stay focused on and be aware of. But I also feel like in regard to like our representative officials who are in Congress, it's insane. Like Nancy Mace, for example, there was a story that just came out about her in Wired, that she, as an actual elected Congress official, it's even more embarrassing that this is she's representing us in South Carolina. But she basically was so triggered by the fact that she had haters as an elected official, which everyone does, that she actually has several different burner accounts where she goes and individually responds to people's hate comments. And then she has her congressional staff also do the same thing. And her congressional staff told Wired basically, like, yeah, I mean, we could actually be doing stuff to help the constituents of South Carolina, but she has us responding to hate comments.
You know, here's the dirty secret. I suspect that that is not atypical.
Yeah.
I suspect that there are a lot of Congress people, that there are a lot of state legislators who are human beings,
Mhm.
right? Who did not think that the cost of public service is some public criticism. And they've got fake accounts that they use to, say the things they wish they could say when people talk shit about them. It is embarrassing. I don't deny that, but I suspect it is not atypical in
Yeah.
terms of the larger. Do you think that elected officials, not just in terms of like average people on the internet talking shit, but do you think that elected officials see someone like you as a threat? Or do you
Mm.
think are you finding it possible? Are you at all trying to reach for comment? Some of the politicians who either you think are interesting or that you think are heinous, and that merit attention either way.
Definitely, yes. I will say when it comes to independent journalism and even just the local press, there is always a specific reporter or a specific newspaper that local officials or politicians in your state are going to find irritating because they just won't let go of a story. And that's something I definitely want to do more special reports and more research into local stories that's happening here in South Carolina, but also in other states. And it's something that I haven't really focused on for a second because um, moving back here, one of the things that I've just been completely catching up on is what's been happening in the federal government and other different moving parts. But I feel like that's important as well, sort of kind of being like the the voice that amplifies the corruption or what's happening in your state or in your city, and not letting go of that. And that's something to continue to cover.
Well, and the other thing I really enjoy in your kind of narrative tone or the way in which you approach your coverage is you do like to connect the dots, right? And that was, I think, what's powerful about the example you gave earlier in terms of the Oklahoma politician,
Mhm.
educator, bullshitter, in that this is the kind of consequences of a larger political culture that the Trump administration creates is that you then see it manifest at the state
Mhm.
level, at the local level, and that's where people can miss it. And before long, instead of a single Trump, you got a dozen Huey Longs,
Yes.
right? Who
Yes.
have instituted themselves, entrenched themselves in power, and it could take decades to remove them or unseat them. Again, as we start to wrap this up, unless you've got topics or conversations that you'd like to explore, on an ambitious level, if there was no a limit to resources, we all know there are clear limits to your time. What's your ideal future of the Jeremiah Patterson show? What's your kind of roadmap for, not just what comes next, but the longer trajectory?
Mm. I think I'm gonna add another story first, and then I'm gonna answer that question because another local story that is essential to cover, and one of the things that I've been covering on my show for a while, is basically what's been going on in North Carolina. So, like, they basically had a Supreme Court election last year, and the Democrat on that seat, she won the Supreme Court seat by 714 votes. Literally for 5 months, the Republican who lost tried to contest the results of that election, even after multiple times, like the Clay County Board of Elections in North Carolina said, no, you're not going to get this, and multiple recounts reaffirming her victory. And basically, what it was a concerted effort by Republicans not to really win the election, but try to find a way to install, hint of discrepancies or
Hmm.
conspiracy theories about voter, you know, voter indecency that happened in a way to get the election. And he was super close because he had buddies on the North Carolina Supreme Court, basically that said they would have installed him. But it was a situation that took local press coverage, independent journalism coverage, and resistance. Because if that story did not get the amount of attention it deserved, we probably would be looking at, the Republican there, Jefferson Griffin, sitting on the Supreme Court in North Carolina instead of Allison Riggs. And so, I mean, that was a win for Democrats there. She finally got sworn in. But I think the other side of that story that is, despondent is the fact that Democrats, even though they're in power in North Carolina, there is like a limited way that they can do such because Republicans last year, when they were going out, like the sore losers they are apparently, my gosh, they wrote legislation that would curtail the incoming Democratic officials' ability to actually govern. And one of the things that the Republicans did was put the it was the state auditor. They put him over the election board in the state of North Carolina, even though Democrats are supposed to control it because they won those seats. And so no other state in the country has a state auditor that is in charge of their state elections. But that's the only Republican that won statewide. So now he's on there.
Well, and
And
it ties back to the Oklahoma story, where part of the goal is not so much the victory, but to undermine the process as a whole, right?
exactly.
To create doubts in the institutions, to create doubts in the electoral process, so that you can end up with powerful governors. You can end up with
Exactly.
powerful judges who can rule and last for decades. The dogs here are in complete agreement, as you can hear in the background. The last segment we have on every MetaViews, of course, is shoutouts, and this is where our dogs are currently giving their own shoutouts. I've, my agenda here today has been essentially to give you a shout out in that the Jeremiah Patterson show on Substack is one of the areas that people can tune in. And MetaViews has modestly recommended 31 subscribers
You
to
have.
the
I did see
Jeremiah
that.
Patterson show. So hopefully after today's episode, more will sign up and hopefully pay for your fantastic services. But do you have any shout outs? Is there anyone in the news ecosystem or in the world at large that you want to say, hey, yeah, the MetaViews crew should check out?
I would have to say a couple of people to check out in independent media are hold on. There are several of them. Okay, I guess another one for instantaneous breaking news, but also good independent journalism that is on the ground and asking the questions is of course Aaron Parnas, a big one that's been getting lots of attention. Midas Touch recently expanded their kind of network to like have like a health podcast in addition to it. So that's a huge independent media spot to check out. Of course, there
And this
are.
is, I got to cut you there because normally I insist only one. Because otherwise people can go on and on and on. And this is where we're trying to wrap the show up, not keep it going any further. Any final thoughts before we conclude?
Final thoughts. Okay. Um, the midterms are coming up. So that's something to be on the lookout for. Watch who's running in your local House races, in your local Senate races, in your local government. And if you're just as enraged as, other people are about what's happening, then definitely consider running for Congress yourself or running for local positions yourself. Because there's going to be, I believe, a surge of youth in these next elections to counter what's happening here.
Right on. And I hope that is in a positive respect, only because we are seeing a lot of polling data that a lot of young white men support the far right and support Trump. So hopefully they're too busy feeling sorry for themselves to vote and show up and be active. But everybody else, show up at the ballot box. You know what they say, vote early, vote often. Thank you, Jeremiah. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. I suppose MetaViews may be one of the early sources of the history of the rise of the Jeremiah Patterson Show as you continue to go on to international acclaim and success. Thanks again, you yourself, everyone else, for tuning in. This has been another fantastic episode of MetaViews. We are on the countdown to the end of season 2. We may have 1 or 2 shows left, but the season finale is coming up, so stay tuned. Then we'll take a little break and come back for season 3. You can find us on all the audio podcast platforms, on YouTube, and of course on Substack, where you can also find Jeremiah Patterson Show. And we'll see you all soon. Stay fresh, stay cool, stay smart, and we'll talk to you soon.